The furnace burned at 2,600 degrees, constant, never cooling, 7 days a week. And sitting 3 feet away, crouched on a tiny wooden seat, was a boy no older than 9. His hands were blistered, his eyes already dimmed from heat. His job? Hold molten glass in a fiery pit that would blind most adults. This wasn't an accident. This was business. In 1900, America needed glass. Bottles for beer, medicine, milk, kerosene. Factories ran night and day. Skilled glassblowers, gaffers, were scarce and expensive. But the gaffer couldn't work alone. He needed boys, 8, 9, 10 years old. Boys whose families were too poor to say no. Boys without laws to protect them. Boys whose lives were traded for a few cents per bottle. The work was brutal. The sticker-up boy held molten glass over a glory hole, a furnace hole blasting heat like a physical strike. The mold boy crouched at the gaffer's feet, closing a hinged iron mold over liquid fire, hands inches from metal so hot it radiated through bone. The carrion boy moved burning glass to ovens while avoiding spills, scalding floors, and shards of shattered bottles. The crack-off boy scored hot glass to finish it. One slip, and he could lose fingers or worse. The heat wasn't incidental. It was designed into the work. Infrared radiation clouded eyes. Floor temperatures exceeded what a human body could endure. Coughs became chronic. Burns etched into every hand. Boys were replaced if they collapsed. Some factories surrounded themselves with barbed wire to prevent escape. Darkness, isolation, fear, everything worked in favor of the owners. Photographer Louis Hine arrived at these factories in the dead of night. His camera captured the truth no law could yet stop. Exhausted, scarred children working through unimaginable heat. By 1913, he had taken over 5,000 photographs across the country, and yet Pennsylvania's legislature did nothing. The glass lobby blocked every reform. They even carved exemptions into law. Children could work nights in glass houses while other industries faced restrictions. Decades of reformers, pamphlets, petitions, and congressional bills failed. The Keating-Owen Act of 1916 passed, but was struck down 2 years later. Pennsylvania's children continued in furnaces. And then, a former boy factory worker changed everything. Michael Joseph Owens, born in 1859 in West Virginia, had lived it all. The heat, the molds, the glory holes, the back-breaking crouch. He grew through the ranks from boy to foreman, watching how the system exploited the smallest hands. In 1903, Owens unveiled a machine that would end it. 6 rotating arms, vacuum-powered, transferring molten glass into molds automatically. No mold boys, no sticker-up boys, no carrion boys. One machine produced 13,000 bottles a day, what once required dozens of boys and skilled gaffers. Within years, the Owens bottle machine eliminated the need for child labor in glass houses. The National Child Labor Committee acknowledged it. Technology, not legislation, finally rescued America's children. Let that sink in. The machine saved lives when laws could not. By the time the Civil War ended, Western Pennsylvania had cemented itself as America's glass capital. The rivers ran fast and deep, ideal for transporting coal and raw materials. Coal itself was abundant, and in the 1880s, cheap natural gas from Ohio and West Virginia began fueling furnaces at a fraction of previous costs. By 1869, glassmaking had become a multi-million-dollar industry, and Pittsburgh's South Side was swallowed whole by smoke, fire, and profit. 70 glass houses crowded a few square miles, their furnaces blazing orange light into the midnight sky, smoke and sulfur coating the air for blocks. America needed glass more than it had ever needed before. Breweries, pharmaceutical companies, and food bottlers all demanded perfectly uniform containers, and the industry struggled to keep up. The problem was simple but brutal. Skilled glassmakers, known as gaffers, were expensive and scarce. These men had spent years mastering molten glass, gathering it on iron blowpipes and shaping it with precise lung power and hands honed to perfection. They could not work alone. They needed helpers, boys crouched at their feet, hands near molten iron, running, carrying, holding, and shaping glass pieces in ways that demanded both precision and near superhuman endurance. Boys as young as 8 or 9, often the children of Irish, Italian, Polish, or Hungarian immigrants, filled these positions. They had no power, no protections, and few alternatives. Pennsylvania had no meaningful child labor law, and the glass lobby ensured it stayed that way. Recruiters, called boy-getters, scoured neighborhoods and orphanages from New York to the Midwest, convincing or coercing children to enter these factories. Some came willingly, some had no choice. Once inside, they faced the furnace, a molten pit burning between 2,000 and 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Gaffers pulled molten gob from the fire, while boys performed the essential support roles. The sticker-up boy, holding glass at the mouth of the glory hole, the mold boy, crouched over hinged iron molds, hands on blistering handles, the carry-in boy, shuttling hot glass to the annealing oven, and the crack-off boy, scoring finished bottles for clean separation. Every task brought constant heat, burns, and injuries. Fingers were lost, skin blistered and hardened into calluses, eyes clouded under the relentless infrared radiation. Heat stroke was routine. Boys collapsed, were revived, and sent back to work. The night shift added another layer of cruelty. From 5 p.m. to 3 a.m., children worked in complete isolation from the outside world. Some factories surrounded themselves with barbed wire, ensuring that no child could escape. By 1908, the photographer Lewis Hine began documenting these horrors, capturing images of exhausted boys whose eyes already seemed decades older than their faces. Despite these revelations, Pennsylvania's legislature turned a blind eye. Glass manufacturers were politically powerful, and reform bills were carved out to include exceptions specifically for glasshouses. Economic arguments prevailed. Removing children from work would harm families and the regional economy. For decades, this cruel system persisted, the industry operating on a foundation built entirely on the labor of children, their bodies and futures sacrificed for molten glass and profit. To understand the true horror of the glass industry in 1890s Pittsburgh, you must step inside a glass house. The danger was not accidental, it was built into every step of production. The primary furnace, called a tank or pot furnace depending on the factory, contained molten glass at temperatures between 2,000 and 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It ran continuously. Even from several feet away, the heat blistered skin. Men who worked there for years often developed cataracts from the infrared radiation searing their corneas. But adults could shield themselves. Children could not. The gaffer, the master glassblower, was the only one handling the molten glass directly. He gathered a gob on the end of his iron blowpipe, rotating, shaping, and inflating it with lung power into the rough form of a bottle. As the glass began to stiffen, it needed reheating. This was the glory hole, a smaller furnace opening with heat so intense it felt like physical force. The boy assigned to this station, the sticker-up boy, held the molten piece at precisely the right angle for reheating. His hands clutched a long iron rod which grew hot in his grip, while the radiant heat baked his face, neck, and arms. A single misstep could ruin the glass or burn him badly. Yet he worked hour after hour, crouched, unprotected,
and often only 10 years old. Even more perilous was the mold boy. The blow mold, a hinged iron form, needed to close around the gaffer's blowpipe at exactly the right moment. The mold boy crouched on a small wooden seat inches from the molten glass, hands on handles that radiated heat, spine curved from constant bending. One moment of inattention, one hand too close to the hinge, and fingers could be lost. The mold boy's work was relentless. The glass house operated 3 shifts. Nighttime was worst, the heat intensified, the darkness isolating, the danger amplified. Some factories even surrounded themselves with barbed wire to prevent children from fleeing. Once a piece was finished, it needed to be carried to the annealing oven, where it would slowly cool to prevent cracking. That was the carry-in boy's role. He walked back and forth hundreds of times per shift, navigating slick floors, avoiding other furnaces, other molten pieces, and shards of hot glass. A stumble meant serious burns or shattered glass. Finally, the crack-off boy scored the hot, nearly finished bottle to separate it from the blowpipe. Mistiming the score caused shards to fly, burning the hands, arms, or face. These boys were essential, not peripheral. Without them, the gaffer could not work, the glass could not flow, and the factory could not profit. Burns, scars, vision damage, and heat stroke were daily realities. Hein's photographs show boys with hands mapped in pale scars, eyes already appearing decades older than their actual age. Diseases developed slowly but surely. Chronic coughs, inflamed airways, respiratory problems. By their teens, many boys had lungs like men in their 40s. Heat stroke and collapse were routine. Medical care was absent. The boys were expected to return to work after only brief rest. In every factory, in every state, the story was the same. From New Jersey to West Virginia to Pennsylvania, children formed the backbone of glass production. They bore the physical cost of an industry designed around profit, speed, and efficiency, their suffering both visible and ignored. And yet, the world outside the glass house remained largely unaware, despite photographs, reports, and reformers' warnings. Inside, molten glass continued to flow, and boys continued to crouch beside it, their youth and health traded for bottles and dollars.
By the 1900s, the country was awakening to the reality that children were working in factories, mines, and glass houses under brutal conditions. But awareness alone wasn't enough. It required someone with courage, persistence, and a camera to make the invisible visible. Louis Hine, a teacher turned social reform photographer, became that witness. Armed with a simple camera, he infiltrated factories and mills across the United States, capturing images that would shock the public and galvanize reform. Hine understood that photographs could tell what words often could not. A 10-year-old boy crouching over a glowing forge, hands blistered, eyes squinting against the heat. No description could convey the raw terror and exhaustion better than the frozen image in a photograph. He photographed children as they worked, their bodies contorted by the demands of industry, faces etched with concentration, fatigue, or pain. Hine's photographs were meticulous. He chose angles that emphasized scale, tiny boys dwarfed by furnaces, massive machinery looming over young workers, sparks and molten glass highlighting their vulnerability. Each photo was a story of courage and exploitation, a visual indictment of industrial America. In glass factories, Hine captured the reality of the mold boys and sticker-up boys. His camera revealed not just the boys, but the conditions around them. Dark, suffocating rooms, heat radiating off molten glass, floors slick with water and shards, supervisors moving between stations, indifferent or unaware of the human cost. The photographs were not just evidence, they were moral calls to action. Hines' work did not remain confined to the photographer's darkroom. He collaborated with the National Child Labor Committee, NCLC, submitting images to newspapers, exhibitions, and reports. People who had only heard of child labor now saw it with their own eyes. Faces of boys whose hands were already scarred, whose eyes reflected heat stroke and fatigue, were published nationwide. Readers could not ignore the reality. Childhood was being stolen. The reaction was both immediate and profound. Reformers used Hines' images to lobby legislators, and public outrage forced politicians to confront the issue. Slowly, laws restricting child labor were proposed and passed, though enforcement lagged. Factories that had hidden behind the veil of industry now faced scrutiny. Owners and managers who relied on child labor were compelled to adapt, and gradually the youngest workers were removed from the furnaces, mines, and mills. Yet Hines' work did not remain confined to the photographer's darkroom. He documented history, reshaped it, one haunting image at a time.
Despite the images Lewis Hine captured and the reports filed by reformers, progress against child labor was painfully slow. Public outrage could ignite conversation, but it could not dismantle entrenched industrial interests overnight. In Pennsylvania, the glass industry, powerful and politically connected, resisted every attempt at reform. Lobbyists were embedded in the legislature, working tirelessly to ensure that any law limiting child labor included exceptions for glass houses. The state's economy depended on these factories, and lawmakers were convinced, often persuaded, that interfering would threaten jobs and profits. The National Child Labor Committee, founded in 1904, knew that legislative battles would be arduous. They commissioned studies, gathered testimonies from physicians, and compiled data about the injuries, diseases, and developmental damage suffered by child workers. The photographs Hine took were distributed to lawmakers and published in newspapers, making it increasingly difficult to ignore the reality. Yet every reform proposal faced carefully crafted amendments that rendered it ineffective. Night work restrictions? Fine, except for glass houses, the law would read. Minimum age? Fine, except for certain industries. The legal system codified exploitation under the guise of economic necessity. Hines' images and the NCLC's efforts did, however, gradually shift public perception. Urban middle-class families who had never seen a child crouched over a furnace now understood that innocence was being stolen for profit. Community organizations and church groups began to rally, organizing petitions, lectures, and public campaigns. Yet, even widespread moral outrage could not immediately overcome the concentrated power of industrial lobbyists. Change required decades of persistence and political pressure that spanned generations. At the federal level, Congress finally passed the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act in 1916, setting minimum ages for work and limiting hours. The law was a landmark, an attempt to assert national authority over a problem previously left to states. For the first time, the idea that childhood had value independent of profit was formally recognized, but the Supreme Court struck it down just 2 years later in Hammer v. Degenhardt, arguing that the federal government had overstepped its authority. Pennsylvania's glass houses, along with other industries across the country, returned to business as usual. The fight was far from over. Despite legal setbacks, the reform movement persisted. Public opinion, now shaped by Hines' photographs, created pressure that could not be ignored indefinitely. Industry could resist regulations, but it could not resist technology. Automation, like Michael Owens' revolutionary bottle-making machine, began to reduce reliance on child labor. Machines could do the dangerous work more efficiently, making the human cost of factory production less necessary. Slowly, factories adapted, and the youngest workers were removed from the most lethal tasks. By the 1930s, the cumulative pressure of advocacy, public awareness, technological innovation, and political reform began to take hold.
The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 finally established meaningful federal protections for children, setting minimum ages, limiting hours, and providing enforcement mechanisms. Childhood, which had been commodified for decades, was legally recognized as a stage deserving protection and care. The story of reform is not one of swift justice. It is a tale of patience, persistence, and relentless moral clarity. It shows how society's conscience, when fueled by evidence and illuminated by truth, can gradually prevail over profit, power, and political inertia. Every photograph, every testimony, every legal battle contributed to a slow, hard-won victory, a victory that reclaimed childhood from the furnaces, from the shadows of industrial exploitation, and from the relentless pursuit of profit at any cost. By the early 1900s, the relentless grind of glass factories had become a symbol of industrial exploitation. Children crouched over furnaces, their small hands blistered and blackened, risking burns and deformity for meager wages. It was a world where innocence was traded for survival, and every day carried the shadow of permanent injury or death. But in this environment of smoke and molten fury, one invention would begin to change everything. Michael Owens, a young and visionary inventor from Ohio, watched the glassblowers and their children at work, fascinated and troubled in equal measure. He understood the rhythm of the furnaces, the precision required to shape molten glass, and the extraordinary danger of the process. Owens saw that children performed repetitive, dangerous tasks because no machine could replicate their nimble fingers. Yet, driven by a mixture of ingenuity and empathy, he sought to build a machine that could automate the very act that had kept children tethered to the furnaces for decades. In 1903, Owens unveiled his revolutionary automatic bottle-making machine. It was more than a marvel of engineering, it was a profound societal pivot. The machine could gather molten glass, shape it, and blow it into bottles with precision far beyond human capability. Tasks that had required the smallest, most vulnerable hands could now be performed safely by gears and pistons. Factories equipped with Owens' machine could dramatically increase production while reducing accidents and eliminating the need for child labor in the most dangerous areas. The impact was immediate and transformative. Children who had once risked burns, crushed fingers, and stunted growth were gradually withdrawn from the furnaces. Families, once dependent on every coin a child earned, began to see a future where education and play replaced endless toil. Owens' invention, in its quiet, mechanical way, rescued childhood itself from the relentless demand of profit. Factories began to modernize, realizing that automation could serve both efficiency and humanity, a rare alignment of industrial need and social progress. Yet the shift was not instant. Some factory owners resisted, claiming that tradition and cheap labor were irreplaceable. Lobbyists continued to push back against child labor laws, arguing that machines could never match the dexterity of a child's hand. Still, as Owens' machine spread across the industry, the evidence was undeniable. Machines increased output, reduced accidents, and most importantly, removed children from immediate danger. The moral argument gained strength, reinforced by data, photographs, and public pressure. Owens' invention did more than change glass production. It catalyzed a national conversation about the value of childhood. Reformers pointed to the machine as proof that industrial progress need not be cruel. It demonstrated that human ingenuity could protect the young without sacrificing profit, showing that technology could be a partner in justice, not just efficiency. Across the country, other industries began exploring similar automation, recognizing that machines could liberate rather than exploit vulnerable workers. By the 1920s, the combination of Owens' machine, gradual enforcement of child labor laws, and shifting social attitudes finally began to reclaim childhood from the furnaces. Children returned to schools, playgrounds, and families, leaving behind the shadows of molten glass and searing heat.
Michael Owens' invention stands as a testament to the idea that innovation can serve not only industry, but humanity, an enduring symbol of hope, progress, and the possibility that even in the darkest factories, compassion and ingenuity can spark profound change.
By the 1920s, America was awakening to a new industrial consciousness. The clanging furnaces that had once demanded the toil of children now hummed with mechanical precision. Factories equipped with Owens' automatic bottle-making machines and other innovations no longer relied on the smallest hands to produce glass. The change was not merely technological, it was cultural, ethical, and profoundly human. Children who had once been trapped in the shadows of smoke and fire were beginning to reclaim their right to play, learn, and dream. Communities began to feel the ripple effects of this transformation. Schools, once sparsely attended because children were working in factories, began to swell with eager learners. Playgrounds appeared in towns and cities, filled with laughter that had long been absent. Families, now unburdened by the constant danger their children faced, could imagine a future where education, not exploitation, shaped their lives. Owens' invention had done more than automate labor, it had restored the rhythm of childhood itself. The broader impact on labor laws and social reform was equally profound. Reformers, armed with the evidence of safer, more efficient factories, pressed for stricter enforcement of child labor regulations. Across state lines, new legislation limited the hours children could work and prohibited them from entering hazardous workplaces. Owens' machine became a symbol of what industry could achieve when innovation aligned with humanity, the preservation of innocence alongside the pursuit of profit. Factory owners, initially resistant, began to recognize the advantages of this new industrial model. Automation increased output while reducing injuries and liabilities, proving that protecting children and maintaining efficiency were not mutually exclusive. Public sentiment shifted decisively, and photographs of children safely attending school, contrasted with the harrowing images of old glassworks, stirred national consciousness. Newspapers celebrated Owens not only as an inventor, but as a quiet hero of social progress, someone whose work bridged the gap between machines and morality. This era also sparked a cultural renaissance in how society viewed childhood. Literature, art, and photography began to celebrate the joys of learning, play, and exploration. The idea that childhood was a sacred, protected time gained universal acceptance. The memory of factories where children had once labored served as a cautionary tale, while Owens' invention stood as a beacon of hope, proof that innovation could rewrite societal norms. By mid-century, Owens' legacy had firmly taken root. The American glass industry became a model for humane labor practices worldwide. His machines continued to produce, but the narrative surrounding them emphasized liberation over exploitation. Generations of children who would never know the blistered hands and sleepless nights of factory labor grew up to contribute to society in ways unimaginable to their predecessors. Owens' innovation had created a ripple effect, extending far beyond the glassworks, reshaping the very moral framework of industrial progress. In the end, Michael Owens' story is not merely of invention, it is a story of liberation, empathy, and the enduring power of human ingenuity. His machines turned molten glass into bottles, but more importantly, they turned the tide of history, giving millions of children back the one treasure they had been denied, a true childhood. The echoes of laughter replaced the clang of furnaces, and the legacy of Owens' vision continues to remind us that technology, when guided by conscience, can elevate humanity itself. By the 1930s, the Owens bottle machine had transformed more than just the glass industry. It had reshaped the very landscape of child labor in America.
The once ubiquitous image of boys crouched beside furnaces, faces scorched by heat, hands blistered and scarred, had begun to fade from factory floors. No longer were children essential to the mechanics of production. The machines could gather, shape, and finish thousands of bottles without a single human hand exposed to molten danger. The Owens machine had turned what had been a deeply entrenched social problem into a solvable industrial challenge. The significance of this innovation reached far beyond the factories themselves. Social reformers and labor advocates finally had leverage. Photographs of boys working in hazardous conditions, once shocking yet insufficient to spur legislative change, now had context. Here was proof that the exploitation of children was unnecessary, economically and technologically. Reports and investigations that had once been dismissed as idealistic or impractical now carried weight. Owens' machine provided the evidence that industry could thrive without sacrificing human welfare. Across Pennsylvania, and eventually nationwide, factory owners slowly adopted automated systems, recognizing both the moral imperative and the economic benefit. Fewer injuries meant fewer lost days of labor and lower costs for medical treatment or compensation. Production soared. Families could now rely on adult wages alone without sending their children into life-threatening workplaces. The Owens machine had created a rare convergence, profit aligned with principle. The ripple effects extended into culture and consciousness. Communities began to recognize childhood as a time for education, exploration, and growth. Schools that had been empty during harvest seasons or industrial shifts began to thrive, filled with children who had once labored in the shadows. Parents no longer faced the impossible choice between survival and safety. Childhood, once a commodity in industrial economies, had been restored as a right. Michael Owens' invention also became an emblem of what visionary engineering could achieve. Historians and engineers alike celebrated the machine as a turning point, not just for glass production, but for labor reform. It demonstrated that technological progress could be harnessed to serve humanity rather than exploit it. Public discourse began to frame automation not as a threat to workers, but as a tool to elevate societal standards. The narrative shifted. Industrial success was no longer measured solely in output and profit, but in the well-being of those contributing to it. By the late 1930s, as the Fair Labor Standards Act finally codified protections for children, the Owens machine had already done more than decades of legislation or advocacy could achieve alone. Millions of bottles had been produced, and millions of children had been spared the furnace's glare. Owens' legacy was cemented. Not only had he revolutionized glassmaking, but he had redefined the moral obligations of industry. Today, the Owens machine stands as a symbol of transformation. It reminds us that innovation is most powerful when paired with empathy and foresight. Children's laughter replaced the clang of iron and the hiss of molten glass. The shadow of exploitation was lifted, proving that one man's ingenuity could ignite change far beyond the factory floor. Michael Owens' vision reshaped a nation, creating an enduring legacy of safety, progress, and the priceless value of childhood itself.